Under the glowing Chicago skyline, where steam drifts up from the streets like old ghosts, there was a man who controlled a huge empire without ever shouting. Tony Accardo never went to prison, not even for one day. But people feared and respected him more than any other gangster in American history. Tonight, we will follow the quiet legend of Big Tuna. He went from being the son of a poor immigrant to the last great boss of Chicago. Picture this in your mind. The year is 1906. The stone streets of Chicago's Little Italy neighborhood are filled with the sounds of people dreaming of better lives and people who are desperate. The air smells like garlic and gun smoke, hope and sadness into this world. A baby is born who would grow up to be the smartest criminal America has ever known. But you would never see his name in big newspaper headlines. It was only spoken in quiet voices. As you listen to this, maybe it is very late at night. The city outside your window is sleeping, but somewhere in the dark, the ghosts of Chicago's past are still walking the same streets that Tony Accardo once ruled. He was strong like iron, but he was also smooth and clever like a soft glove. Before we step into Accardo's world, I want to know something. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Type your city in the comments below. Are you in Chicago, walking the same streets Tony owned? Are you in New York or London? What time is it where you are? 2 in the morning? Perfect. There is something special about hearing crime stories in the middle of the night. If you are new here, welcome to our family of night owls and people who love crime stories. Please press that subscribe button and ring the bell. We post these long stories every day, and they are perfect for listening to late at night. If you are already part of our community, please show some love by pressing the like button. It helps more people find these hidden stories. Now, get comfortable and settle in. This is the full true story of Tony Accardo. It is a 3-hour trip through Chicago's secret criminal world. Let us begin. People say you can understand a man by how he started in life. If that is true, then Antonio Leonardo Accardo was meant for great things from his very first breath on April 28, 1906. He was born in the crowded, small apartments on Chicago's west side, in the heart of the area people called Little Italy. Tony entered a world where staying alive was a skill you had to learn, and respect was as valuable as money. His father, Francesco Accardo, had crossed the Atlantic Ocean with rough hands and dreams of streets paved with gold. What he found instead were factories pumping out smoke and neighborhoods where you did not need to speak English. But you did need to know how to use your fists. Francesco worked in the railroad yards, his back bent from hard work and broken dreams, while his wife Maria took care of the house and prayed her children would find a better life. The Accardo family lived above a small grocery store on Grand Avenue. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the not-so-pleasant smell of too many people living close together. When he was a boy, Tony would lean on the windowsill in the evenings, watching men in fancy suits walk on the streets below. Their steps were confident, and their eyes were watchful, even as a child. He understood these were not working men like his father. These were men who made the rules instead of following them. You might ask yourself, what makes a child choose a life of crime? For Tony, it was not one big moment, but many small realizations. When he was 8, he saw his father come home with his head down after being skipped over for a promotion. The job went to an Irishman who did not work as hard. When he was 10, he watched his mother count pennies at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she tried to make the rent money last. When he was 12, he realized the men in the nice suits never looked worried about tomorrow. The streets of Little Italy in those days were like a tough school. Boys learned early that the world had 2 kinds of people: those who took things and those who had things taken from them. Tony was determined never to be in the second group. Here is something most people do not know about Tony Accardo's early years. He was very smart. Maybe not schoolbook smart, but he had the kind of mind that could understand a room in seconds, figure out odds in his head, and remember every insult and every favor. When he left St. Joseph's Elementary School at age 14, it was not because he could not learn. It was because the streets were teaching him things no classroom ever could. His first job was at a local barber shop, sweeping hair and polishing shoes. But Tony's real learning happened after dark. In the pool halls and secret gambling spots that were scattered around the neighborhood like stars, he learned to play dice with dice that were not always fair, to bet on fights that were already fixed, and to keep quiet when important men talked in low voices. The young man who would become Big Tuna was already showing the skills that would define his criminal life: patience, watching carefully, and an amazing ability to avoid being noticed. While other boys his age got arrested for small thefts or causing trouble, Tony moved like smoke there, 1 second and gone the next before anyone saw him. As you listen to this, picture Chicago in 1920. The Great War is over, leaving the country eager for fun after years of sacrifice. Prohibition has just started, turning regular people into lawbreakers and creating chances for those brave enough to take them. The air itself seems to buzz with possibility and danger. Tony got a job as a delivery boy for a local butcher shop, but his real job was watching and learning. He studied the rhythms of the neighborhood. When the police walked their routes, which store owners could be trusted, which politicians could be bribed, he learned to read faces and voices, to tell the difference between real threats and empty boasting. But it was boxing that really shaped the young Accardo. He was only 5 feet 8 inches tall, but he was built solid like a brick wall. Tony found he had a natural talent in the boxing ring. More importantly, he found that having a reputation was worth more than money. A man known for his fists rarely had to actually use them. Stories say that every king needs his first kingdom. For Tony Accardo, that kingdom was the Circus Cafe Gang. In 1922, at age 16, Tony joined a group of young tough guys who used the Circus Cafe on North Clark Street as their home base. It did not look like much a dirty storefront, with floors covered in sawdust and windows so filthy they turned sunlight into a constant twilight. But for the dreams it held, it might as well have been a castle. The gang was led by a mean fighter named Claude Maddox, who had a reputation for being willing to do things other men would not do. But even then, people who paid attention noticed that when big decisions were made, Maddox's eyes would flick toward the quiet teenager in the corner, Tony Accardo. Their crimes were small at first. They stole trucks loaded with illegal alcohol, ran gambling numbers in the Italian neighborhoods, and collected money for loan sharks. But Tony approached even these small jobs with the careful planning of a general preparing for battle. He studied the routes the trucks took, found the weakest spots in their security, and planned escape routes based on how fast the police would arrive. If you are still awake, no matter what hour you are listening, try to imagine the excitement of those early crimes. The thrill of stopping a truck on a dark road. The good feeling of a plan working perfectly. The amazing taste of easy money. For young men in a world that seemed to offer them nothing, crime was not just a way to make money. It was proof that they mattered. But Tony was already thinking bigger. While his friends spent their money on flashy clothes and fast women, Tony saved his money and studied the men who ran Chicago's criminal world. He watched how they dressed, how they talked, how they got respect without raising their voices. He was getting ready for a future none of his friends could even imagine. The Circus Cafe gang's reputation grew through 1923 and 1924. They were dependable, professional. And most importantly, they did not get caught. Police raids would find empty buildings and cold coffee. Witnesses would suddenly forget what they saw. Evidence would disappear from police storage rooms. It was during this time that Tony got his first nickname. It was not Big Tuna, yet that would come later. They called him the Brain. His fellow gang members started to realize that their quiet friend could think 3 steps ahead of everyone else. When the police set up roadblocks, Tony already knew about other routes. When rival gangs tried to take their territory, Tony had somehow found out about it ahead of time. You might wonder how a teenager could develop such clever criminal instincts. The answer is Tony's greatest strength, his ability to listen. While other men talked, Tony soaked up information like a sponge. He made friends with bartenders, cab drivers, and newsstand workers, the invisible people who saw everything but were rarely noticed themselves. They say that destiny does not arrive with loud trumpets, but with a soft knock on an unlocked door. For Tony Accardo, that knock came on a snowy evening in February 1926, when he was meant to meet the most famous criminal in American history. The meeting happened at a secret bar called the Four Deuces on South Wabash Avenue. Tony had heard the rumors. Al Capone himself would be there, doing business in a back room. At 20 years old, Tony already had a reputation as someone who could be trusted with delicate situations. But this was different. This was the major leagues. Picture this scene. The secret bar is thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of illegal jazz music. Men in expensive coats huddle at small tables. Their voices are low, and their eyes are always moving. The air tastes like bootleg whiskey and dangerous chances. In the corner, almost hidden in the shadows, sits a young man who looks more like a college student than a criminal. Tony Accardo. Al Capone walked in like a powerful storm. Even in those days before, he became the famous face of American organized crime. Scarface Capone demanded attention just by being there. He was loud where Tony was quiet, flashy where Tony was plain, explosive where Tony was controlled. They were almost complete opposites, which might be why they would work so well together. The introduction was set up by Claude Maddox, who had somehow earned a few minutes of Capone's time. "Ah," Maddox said, his voice nervous even though he tried to sound casual. "I want you to meet the kid I've been telling you about, Tony Accardo. Best driver on the South Side and sharp as they come." What happened next became Chicago legend. Capone looked up from his plate of pastel. He always seemed to be eating and studied. Tony with eyes that had seen too much violence for a man barely 30 years old. The secret bar went quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. "You're the one they call the Brain?" Capone said. It was not really a question. "Some do," Tony replied, his voice steady even in this huge moment. Capone smiled. It was not the big fake smile he used for photographers, but a smaller, more real one. "Tell me something smart, kid, and here is what most people do not know about that famous first meeting." Tony did not try to impress Capone with boasting or stories about crimes. Instead, he told him about traffic patterns. For 20 minutes, Tony explained how police patrol schedules created predictable windows of opportunity, how the elevated train tracks could hide the sound of certain activities, how the city's layout created natural escape routes that most criminals never even saw. Capone listened without interrupting, sometimes nodding or asking a question to be clear. When Tony finished, the room stayed silent for what felt like forever. "Kid," Capone finally said, "you just earned yourself a job. As you listen to this, In whatever quiet hour has brought you here, imagine the weight of that moment. Tony Accardo had just crossed a line from which he could never return. He was no longer just another street tough from Little Italy. He was now part of the most powerful criminal organization in America. But even then, people who knew Tony best could see that his dreams were bigger than being anyone's employee, even Al Capone's. Behind those patient eyes was a mind already working, already planning, already dreaming of the day when he would not need anyone's permission to rule. Tony Accardo's change from a street gang member to a Capone lieutenant did not happen overnight. It was a slow process, like watching winter slowly turn to spring. At first, his jobs were simple: driving cars, delivering messages, standing guard while important men did business. But Capone had seen something in the quiet young man that others had missed. Tony Accardo was a natural planner trapped in a tough guy's body. The Chicago outfit in the late 1920s was a huge criminal empire that controlled everything from bootlegging to gambling. From labor unions to corrupt politics, at its center was Al Capone, brilliant and brutal in equal amounts. But around him was a group of lieutenants, soldiers, and helpers who made the whole machine work. Tony's first big assignment came in the spring of 1927. A rival gang had been moving into outfit territory, stealing their alcohol shipments and scaring the owners of their secret bars. Previous tries to fix the situation had failed because the rivals always seemed to know when the outfit was coming. Tony was given a simple task: find out how they were getting their information. What he discovered would make his reputation in the organization forever. The leak was not coming from inside the outfit's ranks. It was coming from a police detective who had been feeding information to the rivals in exchange for a cut of their profits. But Tony did not just find the traitor. He created a clever solution that turned the whole situation to the outfit's advantage. Instead of killing the detective the obvious move, Tony arranged for him to give false information to the rivals. For 3 months, the corrupt cop unknowingly led his criminal partners into trap after trap. Shipments they tried to steal turned out to be empty trucks guarded by outfit soldiers. Secret bars they planned to scare were filled with armed men waiting for them. You might wonder how a man barely out of his teens could arrange such a clever trick. The answer is Tony's greatest gift: his ability to think like his enemies. He did not just plan his own moves. He guessed what they would do and created situations where their natural reactions would work against them. By the time the detective realized he had been found out, it was too late. The rival gang had been crushed, their operations taken over by the outfit, their territory claimed without Tony's men firing a single shot. The detective himself was found floating in the Chicago River, a victim of his former associates who blamed him for their failure. Al Capone's reaction to this victory told everyone in the organization what they needed to know about Tony Accardo's future. At the next meeting of outfit leaders, Capone publicly praised the young man's work, calling him the smartest guy in the room. More importantly, he started including Tony in higher-level planning sessions, asking for his advice on operations that should have been far above his official rank. Legend says that February 14, 1929, was the day Al Capone's war with Bugs Moran came to its bloody end. The street Valentine's Day Massacre would become the most famous gangland killing in American history. While Tony Accardo's exact role remains a mystery, people who knew him best never doubted he was involved in the planning. The operation was classic Capone: bold, brutal, and designed to send a message to every criminal in Chicago about the price of defying the outfit. 7 members of Moran's North Side gang were lined up against a warehouse wall and shot to death with machine guns by men dressed as police officers. It was like theater as much as murder a show, meant to prove the outfit's reach and cruelty. But here is what most people do not know about that famous massacre. The plan almost certainly came from Tony Accardo's careful mind. The fake police uniforms, the timing for maximum shock, the careful choice of a location that allowed for quick escape, these were the signs of Tony's strategic thinking. As you listen to this, picture that cold February morning. Snow covers the streets like a blanket of innocence, muffling the city's sounds. Inside the SMC Cartage building on North Clark Street, 7 men wait for what they think will be a normal business meeting. They have no idea their deaths have been planned with the precision of a military operation. The actual shooting was done by others. Tony was too valuable to risk on such a dangerous job. But his ideas were all over the planning. The escape routes had been checked weeks before. The alibis for key outfit members had been carefully built. Even the choice of Valentine's Day was not random. It was chosen to make sure there would be big newspaper stories and to scare other criminal groups. The massacre did what it was supposed to do. Bugs Moran's organization never recovered from losing 7 key members. Other rival gangs started making deals with the outfit instead of fighting them. Al Capone's reputation became huge, and Tony Accardo's importance in the organization rose even higher. But the massacre also marked the beginning of the end for Capone's rule. The federal government, embarrassed by the bold violence, started focusing huge resources on taking down the outfit's leaders. Treasury agents began following money trails they had ignored for years. FBI surveillance became more advanced and persistent. Tony, with his instinct for survival, saw the changing situation before most of his friends, while others enjoyed their new fame. He started preparing for a future where the old methods would not work anymore. The man who would become Big Tuna was already thinking about how to build an empire that could survive in the shadows, while others looked for the spotlight. The early 1930s were a time of change for both America and its criminal underworld. The Great Depression had settled over the country, making even honest people desperate enough to break laws they once followed. For the outfit, it was a chance disguised as a problem. While real businesses closed and banks failed across the nation, the outfit's various operations kept making steady money. Gambling especially grew as people looked for escape from their money troubles. Loan sharking became more profitable as real banks made it harder to borrow money. Even illegal businesses saw more customers, as regular morals gave way to survival instincts. Tony Accardo, now in his mid-20s, was given more responsibility for watching over these operations. But unlike many of his peers, who were happy to just collect profits, Tony studied each business with the focus of a college student writing a big paper. He spent weeks in gambling halls, not playing but watching, seeing how dealers controlled cards, how the house's advantage was calculated, how security was kept. He talked to bosses and bookies, learning the subtle arts of customer psychology and risk management. He looked over financial records with the thoroughness of an accountant, finding inefficiencies and chances to grow. You might wonder what drove this need to understand every detail of the criminal business. For Tony, knowledge was power in its purest form. Every secret learned, every weakness found, every relationship mapped was another tool in an arsenal he was quietly building for future use. His reputation for being thorough and reliable made him more valuable to Al Capone, who was spending more and more time dealing with legal problems. In 1931, when Capone was finally convicted of tax evasion and sent to federal prison, the leadership of the outfit went to Frank Nitti. But people who paid attention noticed that Nitti asked Tony for advice before making big decisions. The change from Capone to Nitti marked the start of a new time for the outfit. Where Capone had been showy in public, Nitti preferred to work in the shadows. Where Capone had relied on fear and threats, Nitti liked corruption and manipulation. It was a style much more suited to Tony's personality and talents. Under Nitti's leadership, Tony was given his first major independent command, overseeing the outfit's labor racketeering operations. It was a complicated business that needed equal parts violence and diplomacy. Union leaders had to be either bribed or scared into cooperation. Real businesses had to be convinced that protection from labor problems was worth the price they had to pay. Rival criminal groups had to be stopped from moving in on the territory. Tony approached the job with his usual careful precision. He created detailed files on every union official, every business owner, every potential rival. He set up a network of informants that reached from factory floors to company boardrooms. Most importantly, he built a reputation for keeping his word. Those who worked with the outfit could count on protection, while those who crossed it faced quick and sure punishment. With Al Capone in prison, the Chicago outfit faced its biggest challenge since it began. The federal government had shown it could reach even the most powerful criminals, and rival organizations across the country were watching for signs of weakness. It was during this important time that Tony Accardo really began to emerge as a leader within the organization. Frank Nitti, Capone's chosen replacement, was a good manager, but did not have his boss's charm and vision. More importantly, he was haunted by knowing that he too could face federal charges at any time. This fear made him more cautious and paranoid, creating chances for more ambitious men to gain influence. Tony saw the situation for what it was, a test that would decide the outfit's future leadership. While others fought for position with shows of violence or loyalty, Tony used a different plan. He made himself indispensable by solving problems that others could not even see. When labor fights threatened to shut down outfit-controlled businesses, Tony worked out solutions that made everyone happy. When federal investigators started looking into certain operations, Tony put security measures in place that protected the organization without hurting its profits. When rival gangs tested the outfit's will, Tony responded with exactly the right amount of force, enough to keep respect, but not enough to attract unwanted attention. As you listen to this, maybe in the quiet hours when the world sleeps, imagine the careful balance Tony had to keep. Too weak a response to challenges would be seen as weakness. Too strong a response would bring federal heat that could destroy everything they had built. It was a tightrope walk that needed nerves of steel and perfect timing. The key to Tony's growing influence was his ability to think beyond the immediate problem. While others focused on quarterly profits or monthly issues, Tony was planning for the next 10 years. He realized that the outfit's survival depended on its ability to change with the times. One of his most important new ideas was the development of what would later be called the Buffalo Strategy. Instead of relying on a single famous leader who could become a target for federal prosecutors, Tony suggested a more spread-out leadership structure. Important decisions would be made by agreement among a small group of trusted associates. No single person would know enough or have enough authority to bring down the whole organization if caught. This approach was new for its time and showed Tony's understanding of both how organizations work and law enforcement tactics. It also put him in the perfect position for the future leadership role he was quietly seeking. In a system based on agreement, the man with the best ideas and the most allies would naturally rise to the top. The Buffalo Strategy was first tested during the labor troubles of 1934, when federal agents arrested several key outfit members. The organization kept working smoothly because no single arrest had broken its command structure. Profits kept coming in, territories stayed secure, and enemies found no openings to attack. Frank Nitti publicly praised the strength the organization had shown during the crisis. But privately, he knew Tony Accardo deserved most of the credit. It was becoming clear to everyone in the outfit that they were seeing the rise of a new kind of criminal leader, one who preferred influence to authority, planning to quick decisions, and long-term success to short-term gain. By the mid-1930s, America's criminal world was changing fast. The end of Prohibition had taken away the outfit's most profitable money source. Forcing the organization to adapt or die, federal law enforcement was getting more advanced, using new technologies and methods that made the old ways of operating more dangerous. Tony Accardo saw these challenges as opportunities. While his friends mourned the loss of bootlegging profits, Tony was already finding new sources of income that would be more lasting and less visible to federal authorities. His vision for the outfit's future was nothing less than a complete change from a gang of thugs into a sophisticated criminal company. The first part of his modernization plan was diversification. Instead of depending heavily on any single illegal activity, Tony suggested spreading the organization's interests across multiple money streams. Gambling was still important, but it was helped by loan sharking, labor racketeering, political corruption, and even some real businesses that could serve as covers for illegal activities. His second new idea was professionalization. Tony began recruiting people with skills the traditional outfit had never valued. Accountants who could hide money trails, lawyers who could handle legal challenges, politicians who could provide protection from prosecution. He understood that in the modern world, a criminal organization's most dangerous enemies were often armed with briefcases, not machine guns. The third part of Tony's strategy was geographic expansion. Chicago would remain the outfit's home base, but he imagined extending its influence across the entire Midwest and beyond. This needed building relationships with criminal organizations in other cities, making territorial agreements, and setting up communication networks that could coordinate activities across great distances. You might wonder how a man still in his 20s could imagine and carry out such an ambitious change. The answer is in Tony's unique mix of patience and vision. While others focused on immediate rewards, Tony was building something that could last for generations. His ideas were not always popular with the outfit's old members, who were comfortable with familiar methods and suspicious of change. But Tony had learned the art of persuasion from masters like Al Capone and Frank Nitti. He never presented his new ideas as criticisms of existing practices, but rather as natural changes that would preserve what was best about the organization while adapting to new realities. The modernization plan's first big test came in 1936, when federal agents launched a coordinated investigation of the outfit's activities. Previous investigations had mostly used informants and surveillance, making them relatively easy to spot and counter. This new investigation used financial analysis, telephone wiretaps, and other advanced methods that caught many criminal organizations off guard. But Tony had expected exactly this kind of challenge. The diversified structure he had suggested meant the investigation could never focus on a single big operation. The professional advisors he had recruited provided legal and financial know-how that helped the organization stay ahead of federal tactics. The geographic spread of activities made it impossible for any single investigation to threaten the organization's survival. When the investigation ended with only small convictions and no serious damage to the outfit's operations, Tony's reputation in the organization reached new heights. Even the most doubtful old-timers had to admit his methods worked. Frank Nitti started listening to Tony on all major strategic decisions, effectively making him the outfit's real leader, even though he held no official title. Success in organized crime like success in anything else, depends a lot on relationships. Tony Accardo understood this truth better than most of his peers and spent much effort building the connections that would support his rise to power and eventual control of the Chicago outfit. His relationship with Frank Nitti was perhaps the most important during this time. Nitti had gotten Capone's position, but not his natural charm or strategic vision. He was capable but careful, effective but not inspiring. Tony realized that Nitti needed him more than he needed Nitti, and he used this advantage skillfully. Instead of challenging Nitti's authority directly, Tony made himself indispensable as an advisor and doer. When Nitti had ideas, Tony improved them and made them workable. When Nitti faced problems, Tony solved them efficiently and quietly. When Nitti needed someone to handle delicate talks with rival organizations, Tony was the obvious choice. This approach served Tony's interests perfectly. He gained experience in leadership and decision-making without attracting the attention that came with official titles. He built his own network of allies and supporters within the organization while keeping his relationship with its official head. Most importantly, he put himself in position as the natural replacement when the time came for leadership changes. But Tony's network went far beyond the outfit's inner circle. He built relationships with politicians who could give early warning of law enforcement activities. He developed contacts in the media who could shape public opinion of criminal activities. He even kept friendly relationships with certain law enforcement officials who were willing to share information in exchange for favors. One of his most important relationships was with Sam Giancana, a younger man who shared Tony's intelligence and ambition, but had a more unpredictable temper. Where Tony was patient and calculating, Sam was quick to anger and prone to dramatic moves. The differences in their personalities created a natural partnership. Tony provided strategic thinking, while Sam handled situations that needed more aggressive responses. As you listen to this, perhaps in the quiet hours when shadows seem to move on their own, imagine the delicate dance these relationships required. Each person in Tony's network had their own motivations, ambitions, and fears. Managing these relationships needed the skills of a diplomat, the instincts of a psychologist, and the memory of an elephant. Tony also saw the importance of relationships with criminal leaders in other cities. The days when Chicago could work alone were ending. Successful criminal groups would need to coordinate their activities across state and regional lines. He began reaching out to leaders in New York, Kansas City, Detroit, and other major cities, offering cooperation and mutual support. These relationships between states would become crucial as federal law enforcement began seeing organized crime as a national problem rather than a local nuisance. By the late 1930s, Tony had made himself one of the best-connected criminal figures in America, able to call on allies and resources from coast to coast. His reputation for being reliable and discreet made him a natural middleman for talks between different criminal organizations. When territory fights came up, the sides often turned to Tony to help settle them. When joint operations were planned, Tony was often chosen to coordinate the activities of multiple groups. This role as a broker and mediator gave Tony special insights into the strengths and weaknesses of criminal organizations across the country. He learned which leaders could be trusted and which were likely to betray their partners. He found opportunities for growth and investment that others missed. Most importantly, he began to imagine a truly national criminal group with the Chicago outfit at its center. They say the best revolutions are the ones no one notices until they are already over. In the case of Tony Accardo's rise to leadership of the Chicago outfit, this was certainly true. There was no dramatic fight, no bodies in the street, no newspaper headlines announcing a change in power. Instead, There was just a slow understanding throughout the organization that when important decisions needed to be made, everyone looked to the quiet man who had never looked for the spotlight. The change began in earnest in 1943, when Frank Nitti faced federal charges for his part in a movie studio blackmail scheme. The pressure of possible prosecution, combined with his natural tendency toward depression, was too much for the outfit's official leader. On March 19, 1943, Frank Nitti went for a walk along some railroad tracks near his home and shot himself rather than face prison. Nitti's suicide created a power vacuum at the top of the Chicago outfit, but Tony had been preparing for this moment for years. While other possible replacements fought for position and made speeches about their qualifications, Tony just kept doing what he had always done, solving problems, making money, and keeping everyone happy. The clever part of Tony's approach was that he never formally claimed to be the leader of the organization. Instead, he let others believe they were in charge, while he quietly made the decisions that really mattered. When conflicts came up between different groups within the outfit, they brought their arguments to Tony to settle. When new opportunities appeared, they asked for Tony's approval before moving forward. When law enforcement pressure grew, they looked to Tony for ways to reduce the damage. As you listen to this, in whatever quiet corner of the world has brought you here, imagine the subtle skill needed to have power without claiming it. Tony understood that the man who seems to be in charge is often the first target when enemies attack or friends grow ambitious. By staying in the shadows, he protected himself while keeping control over everything that truly mattered. The official leadership of the outfit during this time was technically shared among several senior members, including Paul Ricca, Louis Campagna, and Charlie Fischetti. But anyone who paid attention could see these men listen to Tony on all important matters. He had done something remarkable in the world of organized crime. He had absolute power without absolute responsibility. This structure served the organization well during the difficult years of the 1940s. World War II had created new chances, but also new complications. Government contracts provided opportunities for fraud and corruption, but they also brought more attention from federal agencies. The wartime economy made huge profits from gambling and black market activities, but it also brought competition from new criminal organizations. Tony handled these challenges with the same careful approach he had used for every previous crisis. He found the most promising opportunities and followed them cautiously. Avoiding ventures that had too much risk, he got rid of competitors through a mix of violence, bribery, and strategic alliances. Most importantly, he kept building the outfit's influence in real businesses and political circles. By 1945, it was clear to everyone in the organization that Tony Accardo was the true leader of the Chicago outfit. No matter what titles others might hold, his authority was based not on fear or tradition, but on steady success and good judgment. Men followed him not because they had to, but because they did well when they did. The beauty of Tony's peaceful takeover was that it left the organization stronger, not weaker. There were no internal wars to use up resources or attract attention. There were no bitter rivalries that could be used by enemies. There was just a smooth change from one generation of leadership to the next, arranged by a man who understood that the best victories are often the quietest ones. In the shadows of America's post-war prosperity, a secret organization was forming that would coordinate criminal activities across the whole nation. The Commission, as it came to be known, was the result of decades of change in organized crime, from scattered local gangs to sophisticated criminal companies able to work on a truly national scale. Tony Accardo played a key role in the Commission's creation, though his contributions were typically behind the scenes and not written in any official history. While showier figures like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky got credit for creating the National Syndicate, people in the criminal world knew the Chicago outfit's influence was largely due to Tony's strategic thinking and careful relationship building. The commission worked on principles Tony had been suggesting for years: cooperation instead of conflict, planning instead of quick decisions, and profits instead of fame. Each major criminal organization would keep control of its traditional territory while coordinating with others on matters of shared interest. Arguments would be settled through talk rather than violence whenever possible. New opportunities would be looked at together to make sure they did not mess up existing arrangements. Picture this, if you will: a meeting room in a plain hotel, maybe in Kansas City or Atlantic City, where the most powerful criminals in America gather to discuss business. The conversations are held in quiet voices, with the formality of a company board meeting. Maps are spread on tables, territories marked and discussed, percentages calculated with the precision of accountants, and in the corner, hardly writing anything down but missing nothing, sits Tony Accardo. His role in these meetings was often as a mediator and strategist. When territory fights came up between different organizations, the other commission members often turned to Tony for solutions that would satisfy everyone. His reputation for fairness and his ability to see beyond immediate interests to long-term results made him very valuable in these talks. The commission's influence went far beyond simple coordination of criminal activities. It set standards for behavior that helped make organized crime seem more acceptable in the eyes of certain parts of society. Rules were created covering everything from how to treat regular people to sharing information with law enforcement. Breaking these rules had serious results, up to and including death. Tony's influence on these standards was deep, though rarely said publicly. His philosophy of avoiding unnecessary violence and keeping low profiles became commission policy. His emphasis on corruption, rather than fighting as a way of dealing with law enforcement, was adopted by criminal organizations across the country. His belief that long-term survival needed adapting to changing circumstances became a central idea of the National Syndicate. You might wonder how such a secret organization could set and enforce standards across hundreds of independent criminal operations. The answer was in the Commission's control of the most profitable criminal activities. Organizations that followed Commission rules got access to money-making opportunities and protection from competitors. Those that broke the rules found themselves alone and vulnerable. The Commission also served as a place for sharing information about law enforcement activities, political developments, and business chances. Information collected by one organization's network of informants would be shared with others facing similar problems. New techniques for avoiding prosecution or increasing profits would be shared throughout the syndicate. Most importantly, possible threats to the whole criminal community would be found and dealt with together. Tony's contribution to this information network was especially valuable. The Chicago outfit had always been known for the quality of its information gathering, and Tony had raised this ability to new levels. His network of sources went from street-level informants to high-ranking government officials, providing early warning of law enforcement operations and political changes that could affect criminal activities. The Commission's greatest achievement may have been its success in preventing the kind of destructive wars that had troubled organized crime in earlier decades. Instead of fighting over territory or arguments, criminal organizations learned to see such conflicts as bad for business. The stability this created allowed for amazing growth in both the size and profitability of criminal operations. By the early 1950s, the Commission had effectively created a shadow government that had big influence over large parts of American society. Labor unions, real businesses, political organizations, and even some law enforcement agencies had been entered by syndicate representatives. It was a level of power and influence that individual criminal organizations could never have achieved working alone. Tony Accardo's role in creating this national criminal empire cannot be overstated, even though his contributions were rarely visible to outsiders. He had helped change organized crime from a chaotic collection of competing gangs into a sophisticated network of criminal companies. More importantly, he had done so while putting the Chicago outfit in position as one of the most influential members of the new syndicate. In the huge expanse of the Nevada desert, where mirages dance on super-hot pavement and fortunes are won and lost with the turn of a card, Tony Accardo saw something others missed: the future of organized crime in America. The change of Las Vegas from a sleepy railroad town into the nation's gambling capital is one of the most successful criminal operations in history, and Tony's fingerprints were all over its development. The story starts in the late 1940s, when forward-thinking criminals like Bugsy Siegel began seeing Nevada's potential as a gambling paradise. Legal gambling combined with Nevada's relaxed attitude about where investment money came from created opportunities that did not exist anywhere else in the country. But it was Tony Accardo who really understood how to use these opportunities in a systematic and lasting way. While other criminal organizations focused on building and owning casinos, Tony developed a more advanced approach. The Chicago outfit would invest in real businesses that served the gambling industry: construction companies, food suppliers, entertainment booking agencies, and most importantly, companies that provided financing for casino operations. This plan let the outfit profit from Las Vegas's growth without the visibility and legal exposure that came with direct casino ownership. As you listen to this, perhaps in the small hours when the desert wind carries whispers of dreams put off and fortunes lost, imagine the careful planning that went into this expansion. Every investment was researched completely. Every partnership was negotiated carefully. Every risk was calculated exactly. Tony used the same careful approach that had served him well in Chicago on the unique challenges and chances of Las Vegas. The clever part of the outfit's Las Vegas strategy was its focus on the flow of money rather than the sources of that money. While law enforcement focused on finding which criminals owned which casinos, Tony's people were quietly taking small amounts of profits from dozens of real businesses that supplied those casinos. The amounts taken from any single business were small enough to avoid detection, but together they made huge profits for the organization. Tony's personal involvement in Las Vegas operations was typically indirect but crucial. He rarely visited the city himself, preferring to manage operations through trusted associates who lived there permanently. When problems came up that needed his personal attention, he would fly in under fake names, do his business in private hotel rooms, and leave within hours. One of his most important new ideas was the development of what became known as the skim operation. Instead of stealing money directly from casino counting rooms, dangerous practice that attracted FBI attention, the outfit developed methods for diverting funds before they were officially recorded as casino income. Slot machine profits in particular were controlled using techniques that were nearly impossible to spot without inside knowledge of the systems involved. The size of these operations was amazing by careful guesses. The Chicago outfit was taking millions of dollars every year from Las Vegas by the mid-1950s. More importantly, they were doing so without creating the kind of violence and publicity that had troubled other criminal organizations' attempts to get a foothold in the city. Tony's approach to Las Vegas showed his broader philosophy about the future of organized crime. The days of territory wars and public violence were ending. replaced by a time that would reward subtlety, intelligence, and adaptation to real business practices. Las Vegas was the perfect testing ground for these new approaches to criminal operations. The relationships Tony built with Las Vegas casino operators, politicians, and law enforcement officials became models for similar arrangements in other cities. His ability to provide valuable services, labor peace, protection from competitors, access to money while keeping low visibility made him an ideal partner for businesses that needed to look completely legitimate. But perhaps Tony's greatest achievement in Las Vegas was his recognition that the city's value went far beyond immediate profits. Las Vegas became a neutral meeting place where representatives of different criminal organizations could do business safely. A money cleaning center where illegal profits could be turned into apparently real investments, and a training ground where younger criminals could learn to work in the increasingly complex area between legal and illegal businesses. The success of the Las Vegas operations also showed Tony's ability to adapt his leadership style to different environments and challenges. In Chicago, he had succeeded by understanding the city's ethnic neighborhoods, political corruption, and industrial economy. In Las Vegas, he had to master a completely different set of factors: tourism, entertainment, real estate development, and gambling regulation. By the early 1960s, the Chicago outfit's Las Vegas operations had become so advanced and profitable that other criminal organizations began copying their methods. But Tony had already moved on to finding the next set of opportunities, always thinking several steps ahead of both his competitors and law enforcement. In the quiet suburb of River Forest, Illinois, behind the perfectly cut lawns and wrought iron gates of 915 Franklin Avenue, lived one of the most dangerous men in America. But to his neighbors, Anthony Joseph Accardo was simply a successful businessman who kept his grass perfectly trimmed and never missed his children's school events. This double-life ruthless criminal leader and devoted family man defined Tony Accardo's life and helped his amazing ability to avoid prosecution for decades. The change of Antonio Leonardo Accardo, street tough from Little Italy, into Anthony Joseph Accardo, respectable suburban father, was as calculated as any criminal operation. Tony understood that in post-war America, respectability was a form of camouflage that could protect him from law enforcement attention better than any bodyguard or legal move. In 1934, at age 28, Tony married Clarice Porter, the daughter of a real businessman with no connections to organized crime. The choice was strategic as well as romantic. Clarice came from the kind of family that could help Tony establish his reputation as a law-abiding citizen. More importantly, she had the intelligence and discretion needed to be the wife of a man whose real business could never be discussed openly. Their wedding was a study in contrasts. The guest list included some of Chicago's most notorious criminals alongside politicians, judges, and business leaders who had no idea of their host's true job. The ceremony itself was done with all the signs of upper-middle-class respectability, while the party featured entertainment and spending that would have been impossible to explain with any real income. As you listen to this, in whatever quiet moment has brought you here, imagine the careful balance Tony had to keep between his two worlds at home. He was a husband who helped his wife with household decisions and a father who went to parent-teacher meetings. In the shadows of Chicago's criminal underworld, he was Big Tuna, whose word could mean life or death for men throughout the Midwest. The Accardo household worked according to rules that showed this double life. Criminal associates were never welcome in the family home. Business was never discussed where the children might hear. The violence and corruption that defined Tony's professional life were kept Completely separate from his role as husband and father, Tony and Clarice had 4 children together: Anthony Jr., Joseph, Marie, and Linda. By all reports, Tony was a devoted father who truly enjoyed his children's accomplishments. He went to their sports events, helped with homework, and gave them every advantage money could buy. The children grew up believing their father was a successful businessman in unspecified fields, and most kept this belief well into adulthood. The family's lifestyle showed Tony's criminal success, but was carefully controlled to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The River Forest mansion was luxurious but not showy. The family took vacations to fashionable places, but traveled modestly. The children went to private schools, but were taught to avoid calling attention to their family's wealth. Tony's relationship with his wife was especially remarkable given the pressures of his criminal career. Clarice not only tolerated the mysteries surrounding her husband's business activities, but actively supported the story of his legitimacy. She entertained the wives of politicians and judges, took part in charitable activities, and kept the kind of social connections that improved Tony's reputation as a respectable citizen. But perhaps the most telling part of Tony's family life was his real desire to keep his children away from the criminal world that had made his lifestyle possible. Unlike some criminal leaders who prepared their sons to follow in their footsteps, Tony actively discouraged his children from showing any interest in his business associates or activities. This protective feeling included detailed security measures around the family home. While Tony rarely used bodyguards for his own protection, the Accardo home was watched constantly by men whose job was to make sure his family's safety was never threatened by his criminal activities. The children were taught simple security procedures disguised as family rules, and their activities were watched carefully without their knowledge. The success of Tony's double life as criminal leader and family man helped greatly his ability to avoid prosecution. Law enforcement agencies found it hard to match the image of a suburban father, coaching Little League with their knowledge of his criminal activities. Juries were reluctant to convict a man whose personal life appeared so normal and respectable. More importantly, Tony's family life gave him powerful motivation to avoid the kind of reckless behavior that had destroyed other criminal leaders. He had too much to lose, not just money or power, but the respect of his children and the stability of his marriage. This motivation strengthened his natural tendency toward caution and long-term thinking. At 915 Franklin Avenue in River Forest, Illinois, stands a monument to one of the most successful criminal careers in American history. The Accardo Mansion, as it became known to law enforcement and neighbors alike, served multiple purposes: family home, business headquarters, and carefully built symbol of legitimate success. Its story shows much about Tony Accardo's genius for working in plain sight while remaining hidden from view. The house itself was impressive without being flashy. A 2-story Georgian, colonial with red brick front and white columns, sitting on a perfectly cared-for lot that suggested prosperity without showiness. Tony bought the property in 1951 at the height of his influence within the Chicago outfit, paying cash in a transaction that raised no questions because it appeared to be well within the means of a successful businessman. But appearances, as always with Tony Accardo, were carefully built deceptions. The mansion's true cost was several times the reported purchase price, with big renovations and security improvements that were never written in public records. Hidden within the traditional architecture were advanced defensive features that could protect the people inside from both law enforcement raids and attacks by criminal rivals. The basement, supposedly a family recreation area with a bar and pool table, also served as Tony's main office for doing outfit business. Soundproofing made sure conversations could not be heard from other parts of the house or recorded by electronic surveillance. Multiple escape routes provided options for quick departure if the house came under attack. Storage areas held weapons, cash, and documents that would never see the light of real examination. As you listen to this, perhaps in your own quiet place, imagine the careful thought that went into every detail of this dual-purpose home. The library where Tony read bedtime stories to his children also contained hidden safes holding the financial records of criminal operations covering multiple states. The kitchen, where family meals were made, was equipped with special telephone lines that could not be traced or tapped by law enforcement. The mansion's grounds were equally advanced in their apparent simplicity. The landscaping provided multiple sight lines that let security personnel watch approaching visitors without being seen themselves. The garage was designed to hold vehicles that needed to arrive or leave without being seen by neighbors. Even the swimming pool served a practical purpose. Its construction provided an excuse for big digging that allowed for the installation of underground facilities. Tony's use of the mansion showed his understanding that the most effective hiding places are often in plain sight. While law enforcement agencies used huge resources to watch known criminal hangouts, they paid relatively little attention to a suburban home where a man appeared to be living a normal family life. The mansion let Tony do business with complete privacy while keeping his public image as a legitimate citizen. The house became a symbol within Chicago's criminal community of what was possible for those who learned to balance ambition with discretion. Younger criminals would drive past the mansion, dreaming of achieving similar success and respectability, but few understood the decades of careful planning and patient doing that had made such a lifestyle possible. Law enforcement agencies were well aware of the mansion's true importance, but they found it nearly impossible to get inside its secrets. Search warrants were hard to get because Tony was careful to avoid doing activities that would provide probable cause for court approval. When searches were done, they typically found nothing more criminal than the kind of business records any successful entrepreneur might keep. The mansion also served as a testing ground for Tony's theories about the future of organized crime. He believed that criminal leaders who learned to live like real businessmen would be better placed to survive in a time of increasing law enforcement sophistication. The success of his own double life seemed to prove this theory, encouraging other outfit members to use similar approaches. Visitors to the mansion during its best days described an atmosphere that perfectly captured Tony's personality and philosophy. The public areas were elegantly furnished, but not showy, suggesting prosperity earned through real efforts. The family photographs and children's artwork that decorated the walls created an impression of normal home life. Only those allowed to visit Tony's basement office got any sense of the house's true purpose and importance. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the river forest mansion was how successfully it served its multiple purposes for nearly 40 years. It was at the same time a family home where children grew up in apparent normality, a criminal headquarters where multi-million-dollar operations were planned and coordinated, and a fortress where one of America's most wanted men lived, safely under the noses of law enforcement agencies that desperately wanted to arrest him. For more than 6 decades, Tony Accardo walked a tightrope that would have destroyed lesser men within months. He commanded a criminal empire that made hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits, ordered the deaths of dozens of rivals and traitors, and corrupted countless public officials. Yet he spent exactly 0 days in federal prison for these activities. His ability to remain legally untouchable while building one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history is perhaps the greatest achievement in the records of American organized crime. The secret to Tony's legal invincibility was not luck or political connections, though both played roles, but in his systematic understanding of how law enforcement agencies worked and how they could be defeated through careful planning and patient doing. While other criminal leaders relied on violence and threats to protect themselves, Tony built his defenses around intelligence, misdirection, and legal technicalities. His first line of defense was information. Through a network of informants that went from street-level criminals to federal courthouse clerks, Tony usually knew about law enforcement operations before the agents involved had finished planning them. Grand jury proceedings, supposedly secret, were routinely reported to him in detail. Search warrants were obtained by his associates before they were used. Even FBI surveillance operations were often found and stopped before they could gather useful intelligence. The size of Tony's intelligence network was amazing and showed decades of careful building. He kept sources within the Chicago Police Department, the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, the Justice Department, and even some federal judges' offices. These sources were not necessarily corrupt in the traditional sense. Many gave information in exchange for seemingly innocent favors, or because they had been tricked into believing they were helping real business activities. As you listen to this, in whatever quiet hour has found you, imagine the patience and skill needed to build and keep such a large intelligence operation. Every source had to be recruited carefully, managed discreetly, and protected from exposure. Information had to be checked through multiple channels before being acted upon. Most importantly, the network had to be structured so that no single arrest or betrayal could expose the whole system. Tony's second defensive strategy was the systematic elimination of evidence that could be used against him in criminal proceedings. Unlike many criminal leaders who kept detailed records of their activities, Tony worked on the assumption that anything written down could eventually be used by prosecutors. Important decisions were communicated verbally through trusted go-betweens. Financial transactions were structured to hide their true purposes and participants. Even routine business communications were done in code words that would appear innocent to outside observers. This obsession with operational security extended to every part of Tony's criminal activities. Meetings with subordinates were held in locations that changed frequently and were checked for electronic surveillance devices. Telephone conversations were limited to harmless topics or done in coded language. Even his closest associates were kept ignorant of activities outside their immediate responsibilities, making sure that no single person knew enough to seriously damage the organization if caught. The third pillar of Tony's defense was legal sophistication. Long before other criminal leaders saw the importance of high-quality legal representation, Tony was putting together a team of attorneys who specialized in different aspects of criminal defense. Tax lawyers helped structure his finances to reduce vulnerability to income-related prosecutions. Constitutional specialists found procedural defenses that could invalidate evidence or testimony. Even trial lawyers were chosen based on their ability to create reasonable doubt rather than their willingness to use theatrical tactics. Tony's legal team worked ahead of time rather than after the fact, finding possible vulnerabilities before they became actual prosecutions. They watched changes in federal law that might affect the organization's activities, advised on the legal meanings of proposed operations, and developed backup plans for various prosecution situations. This approach let Tony stay ahead of law enforcement tactics, rather than simply responding to them after investigations had begun. Perhaps most importantly, Tony understood that his legal invincibility depended on keeping the image of a legitimate businessman who happened to associate with questionable characters. He built relationships with respectable members of society who could testify to his good character if necessary. He took part in charitable activities that showed his commitment to community welfare. He even paid taxes on at least some of his income, creating a paper trail that suggested compliance with federal tax laws. The combination of superior intelligence, operational security, legal sophistication, and carefully built public image created a defense system that proved nearly unbreakable for decades. Federal prosecutors started numerous investigations of Tony's activities, but they consistently failed to develop evidence that could survive the examination of competent defense attorneys and doubtful juries. The few times Tony was arrested on criminal charges, the cases typically fell apart due to lack of evidence, procedural violations, or witness problems. Informants would take back their testimony or disappear completely. Physical evidence would be ruled unacceptable due to constitutional violations. Even when cases went to trial, juries were often reluctant to convict a defendant whose personal life appeared so normal and respectable. Tony's success in avoiding prosecution became legendary within both law enforcement and criminal circles. FBI agents who spent their entire careers trying to build cases against him retired in frustration. Prosecutors who had successfully convicted other major criminal figures found themselves unable to touch the man who was arguably the most powerful criminal leader of his time. But perhaps Tony's greatest achievement was that his legal invincibility never depended on any single factor that could be eliminated or compromised. His defense system was redundant and adaptive, able to change to meet new challenges while keeping its fundamental effectiveness. Even when law enforcement agencies developed new investigative techniques or legal strategies, Tony's organization seemed able to counter them with equal innovation and superior doing. The America that came out of the prosperous 1950s was a nation in the middle of deep change. Tony Accardo, now in his 60s, found himself handling challenges that would have been unimaginable during his rise to power. The social changes of the 1960s affected not just real society, but also the carefully built world of organized crime, forcing even the most adaptable criminal leaders to rethink their methods and assumptions. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, and generational conflicts that defined the decade created new examination of all forms of authority, including the unofficial authority used by organized crime, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover's increasingly aggressive leadership began treating organized crime as a national security threat rather than a local law enforcement problem. New technologies for surveillance and intelligence gathering made the old methods of avoiding detection increasingly outdated. Perhaps most importantly, the very idea of organized crime was becoming public knowledge in ways that had never happened before. The Kefauver Committee hearings of the early 1950s had introduced Americans to the existence of criminal syndicates, but it was the televised Senate hearings of the 1960s that brought organized crime into living rooms across the nation. Suddenly, activities that had once been done in complete secrecy were being discussed on evening news broadcasts and analyzed in newspaper articles. Tony watched these developments with the same careful attention he had always used on possible threats and opportunities. Unlike some of his peers who dismissed the changing times as temporary oddities, Tony recognized that basic shifts in American society would require basic adaptations in criminal operations. The challenge was especially sharp because many of the outfit's traditional activities were becoming politically unacceptable in ways they had never been before. Labor racketeering, for example, had once been seen by many Americans as simply another form of business negotiation. But in a time of increased attention to workers' rights and union democracy, the outfit's control over certain labor organizations was becoming a public relations problem. As you listen to this, perhaps in those quiet hours when the past seems closer than the present, Imagine Tony's careful assessment of these new realities. Every change in public opinion had to be judged for its possible impact on criminal operations. Every new law enforcement technique had to be analyzed for its vulnerabilities and countermeasures. Every shift in political power had to be considered for its meanings for the outfit's network of corrupt officials. Tony's response to these challenges showed his lifelong preference for adaptation over confrontation. Instead of fighting the new realities, he began preparing the outfit for a future in which its activities would need to be even more carefully hidden and its public profile even lower than before. This meant speeding up trends that had been developing for decades, the movement toward real business fronts, the reduction of violence as a problem-solving tool, and the increased professionalization of criminal operations. One of his most important new ideas during this time was the development of what he called generational insulation, seeing that younger FBI agents and prosecutors would be less open to the corruption and intimidation tactics that had worked against their predecessors. Tony began structuring operations so that the older, more vulnerable members of the organization were insulated from direct involvement in criminal activities. This strategy involved promoting younger, cleaner associates to visible positions within the organization while moving veteran criminals into advisory roles that carried influence but little legal exposure. The approach let the outfit keep continuity of leadership while adapting to new law enforcement realities. Tony also saw that the changing social climate created opportunities as well as challenges. The sexual revolution and changing attitudes toward gambling, for example, opened new markets for services the outfit could provide. The growing drug culture created demand for products the organization had previously avoided due to their legal risks. Even the anti-war movement created chances for profit through document forgery and draft avoidance services. But perhaps Tony's most forward-looking observation about the changing times was his recognition that the future of organized crime lay in activities that looked completely legitimate to outside observers. The days of obvious criminal operations bootlegging, numbers running, protection rackets were ending. Future profits would come from sophisticated financial crimes, political corruption, and the control of real businesses for illegal purposes. This vision needed a basic change in the type of person the outfit recruited and promoted. Instead of street fighters and traditional criminals, Tony began looking for individuals with accounting skills, legal training, and political connections. The organization began to look more like a criminal consulting firm than a traditional gang. The change was not without its complications. Many veteran outfit members were uncomfortable with the new approaches and doubtful of Tony's predictions about the future. Some questioned whether an organization that avoided violence and worked entirely behind legitimate fronts could keep the fear and respect needed to work effectively. Tony's response to these concerns was characteristically patient and persuasive. He pointed out that the outfit's most successful operations had always been those that attracted the least attention. He showed how the new approaches were creating larger and more lasting profits than traditional criminal activities. Most importantly, he showed how the organization's survival depended on its ability to change with changing times. By the late 1960s, Tony Accardo had achieved something unprecedented in the world of organized crime. He had built a criminal empire so sophisticated and self-sustaining that it could work effectively without his daily involvement. This accomplishment let him begin the gradual process of stepping back from active leadership while keeping final authority over the organization he had spent 4 decades perfecting. The decision to reduce his direct involvement in day-to-day operations was not driven by age or loss of interest. Though Tony was now in his 60s, instead, it showed his understanding that the changing law enforcement situation made high-profile criminal leaders increasingly vulnerable to prosecution. The FBI's new emphasis on organized crime, combined with improved surveillance technologies and more aggressive prosecutors, meant that visible leadership was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Tony's approach to stepping back showed the same strategic thinking that had characterized his entire criminal career. Rather than simply retiring or transferring power to a chosen replacement, he carried out a gradual change that preserved his influence, while reducing his legal exposure, a process that would take more than a decade to complete, and would establish Tony as the first major criminal leader to successfully engineer his own succession while remaining alive and free. The first phase of the change involved finding and developing the next generation of outfit leadership. Tony had been preparing for this moment for years, carefully judging the strengths and weaknesses of various candidates while creating opportunities for them to show their capabilities. Unlike traditional succession planning, which typically focused on a single heir, Tony's approach involved spreading leadership responsibilities among several individuals who could provide checks and balances on each other's power. Sam Giancana, despite his unpredictable temper, was given increased responsibility for the outfit's most visible operations, those that needed a public face and the ability to negotiate with other criminal organizations. His natural charm and street credibility made him an effective representative of the organization's interests, while his tendency toward dramatic moves served Tony's purposes by attracting law enforcement attention away from more subtle activities. As you listen to this, in whatever quiet corner of the night has brought you here, imagine the delicate calculation needed to manage such a change. Every giving of authority had to be carefully balanced to keep organizational effectiveness while protecting Tony's final position. Every new leader had to be given enough power to work effectively while being kept dependent on Tony's continued approval and support. The cleverness of Tony's succession planning lay in his recognition that no single individual could replace him effectively. His own rise to power had been possible partly because previous outfit leaders had concentrated too much authority in their own hands, creating opportunities for ambitious subordinates. By spreading leadership functions among multiple individuals, Tony created a system that was both more stable and more difficult for any single person to overturn. Financial operations were put under the control of individuals with accounting and business backgrounds who understood the increasingly complex world of money cleaning and tax avoidance. Enforcement activities were managed by specialists who could use violence carefully when necessary, while avoiding the kind of public attention that had troubled earlier generations of criminals. Political corruption and law enforcement relationships were handled by individuals with the social connections and diplomatic skills needed to work in legitimate society. Tony's personal role slowly changed from operational leader to strategic advisor and final decision maker. He continued to be consulted on all major decisions, but the actual doing of policies was handled by his chosen subordinates. This structure let him keep control over the organization's direction while creating believable deniability for specific criminal activities. The change also involved a basic change in Tony's lifestyle and public profile. The man who had once been closely involved in every part of outfit operations began to live more like a retired businessman enjoying the results of a successful career. He spent more time with his family, took up gardening as a serious hobby, and even began making charitable contributions to real organizations. But appearances, as always with Tony Accardo, were carefully built deceptions. His apparent retirement was actually a sophisticated form of operational camouflage that let him continue directing criminal activities while appearing to have distanced himself from such matters. The garden where he spent hours caring for his tomatoes also served as a secure location for holding sensitive conversations. The charitable activities provided opportunities to develop relationships with real community leaders who could be useful in future operations. Law enforcement agencies were well aware that Tony's apparent retirement was largely an act, but they found it increasingly difficult to develop evidence of his continued involvement in criminal activities. The organizational changes he had carried out created layers of insulation between him and actual crimes, while his reduced public profile made him a less attractive target for the kind of high-visibility prosecutions that federal officials preferred. The success of Tony's strategic withdrawal became a model for other aging criminal leaders who saw that survival in the modern time required new approaches to leadership and succession. But few had the patience, intelligence, and organizational skills needed to carry out such a complex change successfully. Perhaps most remarkably, Tony's stepping back from active leadership actually improved rather than reduced his reputation within the criminal community. His ability to keep control while reducing his legal exposure was seen as the final demonstration of criminal sophistication. Younger criminals studied his methods with a respect typically saved for military strategists or business innovators. In the early hours of November 17, 1978, in the quiet town of Speedway, Indiana, 4 young employees of a burger chef restaurant disappeared without a trace. Their bodies would be found 2 days later in a wooded area 20 miles away. Execution-style murders that shocked the local community and confused law enforcement for decades. While the case officially remains unsolved, whispers in the criminal underworld suggested a connection to Tony Accardo and the final demonstration of his organization's reach and ruthlessness. The victims Jane Freed, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemons, and Ruth Shelton were ordinary young people working ordinary jobs in an ordinary small town. None had any known connections to organized crime or criminal activities. Their deaths seemed senseless. Random acts of violence that had no explanation beyond simple robbery gone wrong. But investigators who looked deeper into the case began to find suggestions of something far more sinister. The first clue that this might be more than a local crime came from the professional nature of the killings. The victims had been shot with the precision of experienced assassins, not the panic-driven desperation of amateur criminals. The crime scene showed evidence of careful planning, and doing that was not consistent with a spontaneous robbery. Most tellingly, the restaurant safe had been opened using the combination rather than forced open, suggesting inside knowledge that random robbers would not have. Federal investigators quietly began exploring connections between the burger chef murders and ongoing investigations into Midwest organized crime activities. They discovered that the restaurant chain had been experiencing labor troubles at several locations, with union organizers reporting intimidation and threats from unknown sources. More importantly, they learned that Burger Chef's parent company had been negotiating financing arrangements with investors who had suspected connections to criminal organizations. As you listen to this story unfold in whatever quiet hour has brought you here, imagine the careful investigation needed to trace connections between a small town, multiple murder, and the shadowy world of organized crime. Every financial transaction had to be analyzed, every business relationship examined, every coincidence judged for its possible significance. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, as evidence seemed to disappear whenever investigators got too close to meaningful discoveries. The theory that came from this investigation suggested that the Burger Chef murders were not random crimes, but carefully planned executions designed to send a message to business leaders who were resisting criminal entry into their operations. The 4 young victims had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, witnesses to activities they could not have understood. but whose knowledge made them problems to be eliminated. Tony Accardo's alleged connection to the case came through several indirect channels. Investigators discovered that some of the investors involved in Burger Chef's financing had previous business relationships with companies known to be controlled by the Chicago outfit. Phone records showed communications between Indiana and Illinois numbers that suggested coordination of activities across state lines. Most interestingly, the timing of the murders matched the resolution of labor disputes that had been threatening the profitability of several Burger Chef locations. But as with so many criminal activities linked to Tony Accardo, the evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial. No direct connections could be established between him and the planning or doing of the murders. No witnesses could place him or his known associates in Indiana during the relevant time period. The investigation ultimately stopped due to lack of evidence that could support criminal charges. The Burger Chef case, if indeed connected to Tony's organization, would represent the result of his change from street-level criminal to sophisticated business operator. The murders served multiple purposes, eliminating possible witnesses, demonstrating the results of resistance to criminal influence, and establishing dominance in a new geographic territory. They were business decisions done with the cold efficiency that had characterized Tony's approach to criminal activities for 5 decades. What made the case especially chilling was its demonstration of how organized crime had adapted to modern business environments. Instead of the obvious territory disputes and public violence that had characterized earlier times, criminal organizations were now capable of influencing real businesses through sophisticated campaigns of intimidation and elimination. The 4 young Burger Chef employees had died not because of anything they had done, but because their deaths served larger organizational purposes they could not have imagined. Law enforcement officials who worked on the case came away with a deep sense of frustration and unease. They understood that they were dealing with criminal organizations that had changed far beyond the capabilities of traditional investigative methods. The careful insulation of leaders from actual crimes, the use of real businesses as fronts for illegal activities, and the systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses created challenges that seemed almost impossible to overcome. The Burger Chef murders also marked a turning point in public perception of organized crime. Previous criminal activities had typically targeted other criminals or individuals directly involved in illegal operations. The apparent murder of 4 innocent young people for purely business purposes demonstrated a level of coldness that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. It suggested that criminal organizations had become so powerful and confident that they no longer felt limited by traditional boundaries between the criminal and real worlds. For Tony Accardo, if indeed connected to the case, the murders represented both a demonstration of his organization's continued power and perhaps his final major criminal operation. By 1978, he was 72 years old and had been gradually reducing his involvement in day-to-day criminal activities. The sophisticated planning and doing required for the Burger Chef operations suggested the work of someone with decades of experience in organizing complex criminal operations. But the case also highlighted the risks of keeping criminal activities going into a time of improved law enforcement capabilities. While Tony and his organization had successfully adapted to many changes in the legal and social environment, the Burger Chef investigation showed that even the most carefully planned operations could leave traces that dedicated investigators might eventually piece together. The fact that the case remains officially unsolved more than 4 decades later is itself proof of the sophistication of the criminal organization allegedly responsible. Despite extensive investigations by local, state, and federal agencies, no arrests have ever been made in connection with the murders. The case files contain thousands of pages of evidence and testimony, but nothing that conclusively identifies the killers or their motives. In the criminal underworld, however, the Burger Chef murders became part of Tony Accardo's legend. They were seen as evidence of his organization's continued reach and ruthlessness, even as its leader entered his final years. The message sent by the murders, that resistance to criminal influence carried severe results, echoed throughout the business community for years to come. In the autumn of his life, Tony Accardo found comfort in the most unlikely of places, among the tomato plants and rose bushes of his perfectly kept garden behind a river forest mansion. To observers watching from FBI surveillance posts, the sight of America's most powerful criminal leader caring for his vegetables with the dedication of a suburban retiree seemed almost unreal. But for those who truly understood Tony, the garden represented the perfect picture for his approach to life and leadership. Patient care yielding abundant rewards. The change of Big Tuna from feared criminal mastermind to devoted gardener was both real and calculated, showing the same careful balance between appearance and reality that had defined his entire career. The garden provided real reasons for spending hours outdoors in locations where electronic surveillance was difficult, creating opportunities for holding sensitive conversations while appearing to pursue an innocent hobby. More importantly, the garden represented Tony's philosophical approach to power and legacy. Like the plants he cared for, criminal organizations needed patient nurturing, careful attention to environmental conditions, and the wisdom to know when to cut away disease or unnecessary elements. The lessons learned from decades of criminal leadership found expression in his treatment of soil and seedlings. As you listen to this, in whatever quiet hour has brought you here, picture the scene. An elderly man in worn work clothes, his hands stained with earth, carefully tending rows of vegetables that would feed his family and friends. The image seems so ordinary, so innocent, that it is hard to match with the reality of who this man was and what he had accomplished in his long criminal career. Tony's passion for gardening became legendary among his associates, who were often called to meetings that took place among the tomato plants or beside the rose trellises. These outdoor conferences served multiple practical purposes. They were difficult to record electronically. They could be disguised as social visits, and they let Tony show his continued vitality and engagement with life despite his advanced age. The garden also provided a place for what amounted to Tony's informal life stories. Younger members of the organization would be invited to help with planting or harvesting, times that Tony used to share stories and lessons from his long career. These conversations were never recorded and rarely discussed afterward, but they served to pass on the collected wisdom of one of organized crime's most successful practitioners to the next generation. His approach to gardening showed the same attention to detail that had characterized his criminal activities. He studied soil conditions, weather patterns, and plant genetics with the intensity he had once used on law enforcement procedures and rival organizations. His gardens produced vegetables and flowers that were the envy of his suburban neighbors, none of whom suspected that their admiration was directed toward one of America's most notorious criminals. The symbolic meaning of Tony's gardening was not lost on law enforcement agencies that continued to watch his activities. FBI reports from this period contain detailed observations about his gardening practices, as if agents hoped to find criminal meaning in his choice of fertilizers or pruning techniques. The fact that America's premier criminal organization was now being watched through surveillance of its leaders' tomato plants seemed to symbolize how much the situation of organized crime had changed. But Tony's garden years were not entirely peaceful. The ongoing federal investigations, though they never resulted in successful prosecutions, created constant stress that took its toll on his health and family life. His children, now adults with families of their own, struggled to match their memories of their loving father with the public image of him as a criminal mastermind. The garden became a refuge where family relationships could be kept away from the pressures of his public fame. The physical demands of gardening also provided Tony with a form of therapy for the collected stress of his criminal career. The simple, honest work of planting and harvesting offered a strong contrast to the deception and violence that had defined his professional life. In the garden, results were directly proportional to effort invested, and success was measured in terms that had nothing to do with money or power. Tony's neighbors in River Forest grew used to seeing him working in his garden at all hours of the day and night. Sleeplessness, a common problem among men who have spent decades worrying about enemies and investigations, often drove him outdoors in the early morning hours when the rest of the suburb slept peacefully. These solitary hours among his plants may have been the only times in his adult life when Tony Accardo was truly alone with his thoughts. The garden also served as a place for Tony's gradual coming to terms with his own mortality. Men in his profession rarely live long enough to think about their legacies. But Tony's remarkable survival had given him the luxury of reflection that few criminal leaders ever experienced. Among his plants, he could consider what he had accomplished, what it had cost, and what would remain after he was gone. His gardening activities became increasingly important as his direct involvement in criminal affairs continued to decrease. The garden provided purpose and structure to days that might otherwise have been empty, while keeping the story that he was simply a retired businessman enjoying his golden years. Even federal agents who had spent decades trying to convict him began to wonder if Tony Accardo had finally succeeded in becoming the legitimate citizen he had always pretended to be. On May 27, 1992, Tony Accardo died peacefully in his sleep at St. Mary of Nazareth Hospital in Chicago, surrounded by family members who had gathered to say their final goodbyes. He was 86 years old and had suffered from heart and breathing problems that showed both his advanced age and the collected stress of nearly 7 decades in organized crime. His death marked the end of the longest and most successful criminal career in American history. The news of Tony's death created ripples that went far beyond Chicago's criminal underworld. FBI agents who had spent their entire careers trying unsuccessfully to convict him felt a mixture of frustration and grudging respect for a man who had outmaneuvered them for so long. Prosecutors who had built their reputations on convicting organized crime figures found themselves praising, though privately, a criminal whose sophistication they had never been able to match with legal strategies. The funeral arrangements showed the same careful balance between respectability and criminal reality that had characterized Tony's entire life. The services were held at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. With all the signs of a legitimate businessman's farewell, hundreds of mourners attended, including politicians, judges, business leaders, and other members of respectable society who had known Tony only as a successful entrepreneur and devoted family man. But law enforcement agencies used the funeral as an opportunity to photograph and identify criminals from across the country who came to pay their respects to a man many considered the greatest leader in organized crime history. The guest list read like a who's who of American organized crime, representing families and organizations from New York to Las Vegas, from Detroit to Kansas City. As you listen to this final chapter in whatever quiet moment has brought you here, imagine the unreal scene of Tony Accardo's funeral. Hundreds of dangerous criminals gathered in a suburban cemetery, many of them weeping real tears for a man who had commanded their fear and respect for decades. It was proof of Tony's unique position in the criminal world that his death could bring together men who had spent years trying to kill each other. The speeches given at Tony's funeral were masterpieces of diplomatic uncertainty. Speakers praised his devotion to family, his loyalty to friends, and his success in business, carefully avoiding any direct reference to the criminal activities that had made such success possible. But those who knew how to listen between the lines understood that they were hearing tributes to one of organized crime's most innovative and effective leaders. Tony's death also created a power vacuum within the Chicago outfit that would never be adequately filled. While he had spent years preparing for his succession, no single individual had the combination of intelligence, patience, and strategic vision that had made his leadership so effective. The organization would continue to exist and even do well in certain areas, but it would never again achieve the level of influence and respect it had commanded under Tony's direction. Federal law enforcement agencies marked Tony's death as the end of a time in their ongoing war against organized crime. The techniques and strategies that had been developed to fight his organization became templates for investigating other criminal operations. The failures of numerous prosecutions against Tony provided lessons that would inform future cases against his successors and imitators. Perhaps most importantly, Tony's death represented the end of organized crime's golden age of invisibility. A man who had perfected the art of working in plain sight while remaining hidden from view had taken his secrets with him to the grave. Future criminal leaders would find it much more difficult to achieve the level of legal invincibility that Tony had kept for more than 6 decades. The investigation of Tony's estate provided final insights into the size of his criminal success. While much of his wealth had been carefully hidden through real investments and business fronts, the parts that were documented suggested a fortune that was enormous by any standards. Properties in multiple states, investments in dozens of companies, and financial arrangements that spanned the globe created a picture of a criminal operation that had achieved unprecedented sophistication and success. But perhaps the most telling part of Tony's death was how peacefully it occurred. In a profession where violent death was the norm and old age was rare, Tony Accardo had achieved something almost unprecedented. He had died in his own bed, surrounded by loved ones, with his reputation and legacy intact. It was a final victory in a career built on victories that others had thought impossible. The media coverage of Tony's death was extensive, but carefully controlled. Newspapers and television stations struggled to find the appropriate tone for covering the death of a man who was at the same time one of America's most notorious criminals and someone who had never been successfully convicted of a major crime. The result was coverage that acknowledged his criminal reputation while avoiding language that might expose news organizations to legal suits from his survivors. In the years following Tony Accardo's death, the true size of his impact on American organized crime began to emerge as law enforcement agencies analyzed the patterns and methods he had pioneered. What they discovered was that Big Tuna had not simply been a successful criminal leader. He had been a revolutionary who had basically changed how criminal organizations worked, survived, and prospered in modern America. The most obvious part of Tony's legacy was the organizational model he had developed for the Chicago outfit. His emphasis on spread-out leadership, operational security, and real business fronts became the template that criminal organizations across the country tried to copy. FBI training materials began including case studies of Accardo's methods as examples of the sophisticated techniques that agents should expect to meet in their investigations. But Tony's influence went far beyond organizational structure. His philosophical approach to criminal leadership, emphasizing patience over aggression, planning over quick decisions, and long-term success, over short-term gains represented a basic shift in how serious criminals thought about their profession. The loud, publicity-seeking gangsters of the Capone time were replaced by a generation of leaders who understood that invisibility was more valuable than fame. The legal strategies that Tony had used to avoid prosecution became standard practices for criminal defense attorneys. His use of real businesses as cover for illegal activities, his careful structuring of financial transactions to avoid tax responsibility, and his systematic building of relationships with corrupt officials created playbooks that would be studied and copied for decades after his death. Perhaps most importantly, Tony's success in keeping a front of respectability while doing criminal activities showed that the traditional boundaries between legitimate and criminal society were more porous than anyone had previously imagined. His ability to move freely in respectable social circles while directing a criminal empire challenged ideas about how such organizations could be identified and fought. As you listen to this final reflection, in whatever quiet hour has brought you to this story, consider the paradox of Tony Accardo's legacy. A man who spent his life breaking laws and corrupting institutions became in death a case study for how those same institutions could better protect themselves against future corruption. His criminal innovations became the foundation for improved law enforcement techniques. The geographic reach of Tony's influence also became apparent after his death. Investigators discovered that the Chicago outfit's methods had been adopted by criminal organizations from coast to coast. Italian-American crime families, Irish gangs, Mexican drug cartels, and even emerging Russian criminal groups had included elements of the Accardo model into their own operations. Educational institutions began studying Tony's career as an example of strategic leadership in organizational development. Business schools analyzed his methods for building and keeping complex organizations. Military academies examined his approaches to intelligence gathering and operational security. Even real corporations found lessons in his techniques for managing diverse operations across multiple areas. The cultural impact of Tony's career was equally important. His story challenged popular stereotypes about organized crime that had been shaped by Hollywood movies and sensationalized media coverage. The reality of a criminal leader who is more likely to be found in a corporate boardroom than a back alley secret bar forced Americans to face uncomfortable truths about the sophistication of modern criminal operations. Tony's influence on law enforcement practices continued to change long after his death. The techniques developed to investigate his organization became standard procedures for fighting organized crime. The legal precedents established in unsuccessful prosecutions of his activities provided frameworks for future cases. Even the surveillance technologies developed to watch his movements influenced the broader development of law enforcement capabilities. The political meanings of Tony's career also had lasting effects. His success in corrupting public officials at all levels of government led to reforms in ethics laws, campaign finance regulations, and conflict of interest policies. The recognition that criminal organizations could achieve significant influence over real political processes started movements for greater transparency and responsibility in government. But perhaps the most lasting part of Tony Accardo's legacy was the demonstration that criminal success, like any other form of success, needed intelligence, discipline, and long-term planning. The image of the criminal as a violent, impulsive, short-sighted individual was replaced by an understanding that the most dangerous criminals might be indistinguishable from successful businessmen or community leaders. In Chicago itself, Tony's ghost seemed to remain in the shadows of the city's business district and political hallways. Investigators continued to meet criminal techniques and organizational structures that showed his fingerprints decades after his death. The outfit, while reduced, continued to work using methods he had pioneered. Even real businesses in Chicago sometimes found themselves suspected of connections to organized crime simply because they used practices that resembled those Tony had used to hide his criminal activities. The academic study of organized crime was permanently changed by Tony's career. Criminologists, sociologists, and historians found in his story a case study that challenged existing theories about criminal behavior and organizational development. His success in avoiding prosecution while building a criminal empire that lasted for decades forced scholars to rethink their assumptions about law enforcement effectiveness and the nature of criminal leadership. And so ends the story of Tony Accardo, a man who lived in the shadows and died in his sleep, peacefully surrounded by family. In a world where gangsters typically meant violent ends, Big Tuna wrote his own rules until the very end. He had achieved something that seemed impossible in the brutal world of organized crime. He had won. Consider, if you will, the remarkable arc of this man's life. From the small apartments of Little Italy to the mansions of River Forest. From street corner tough to criminal mastermind. Tony Accardo had changed not just himself, but the very nature of organized crime in America. He had taken the crude, violent methods of Prohibition-era gangsters and changed them into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. A criminal organization that looked and worked like a real corporation. What made Tony's story truly extraordinary was not just his criminal success, but his understanding that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones. While his peers fought bloody wars for territory and headlines, Tony built a silent empire based on intelligence, patience, and the revolutionary idea that the best criminals are the ones nobody suspects. He proved that in America, where image often matters more than reality, a man could commit terrible crimes and still die peacefully in his own bed if he was smart enough to never look like a criminal. The lessons of Tony Accardo's life go far beyond the world of organized crime. His story is in many ways a dark mirror of the American dream itself, the immigrant's son who achieved wealth and power through intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations others tried to put upon him. That he chose crime as his vehicle for advancement has not reduced the remarkable nature of his achievements, even as it highlights the moral cost of such success. As you have listened to this story through the quiet hours, perhaps you have wondered what made Tony different from the countless other criminals who tried and failed to achieve what he accomplished. The answer lies not in any single factor, but in his unique combination of traits: the patience to plan for decades rather than months, the intelligence to see opportunities others missed, the discipline to keep fronts that others would have abandoned under pressure, and perhaps most importantly, the wisdom to know that true power often requires the appearance of powerlessness. Tony Accardo's legacy continues to influence both criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies more than 3 decades after his death. The methods he pioneered are still being used by criminal operations around the world, while the techniques developed to fight his organization continue to change in response to new threats. In this ongoing cat-and-mouse game between criminals and law enforcement, Tony's ghost remains an active participant. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Tony's legacy is what it reveals about the nature of power and respectability in American society. His success in keeping a front of legitimacy while directing a criminal empire showed that our assumptions about who can be trusted and who should be feared may be basically flawed. The man who could order murders over breakfast and coach Little League in the afternoon challenges our comfortable beliefs about the visibility of evil. In Chicago, where steam still rises from manholes like ghosts of the past, Tony Accardo's story has become part of the city's folklore. Cab drivers tell tourists about the mansion in River Forest where Big Tuna once lived. Reporters write anniversary pieces about unsolved crimes that may have been connected to his organization. Former FBI agents, now retired, give interviews about their unsuccessful attempts to convict the man they at the same time hunted and admired. The true measure of Tony Accardo's impact may be found not in the crimes he committed or the money he made, but in how he changed the way we think about crime itself. Before Tony, organized criminals were relatively easy to identify. They looked and acted like criminals. After Tony, law enforcement agencies had to face the possibility that the most dangerous criminals might be the ones who look like everyone else. What did you think of Tony's story? Did it surprise you how different he was from the Hollywood gangster stereotype? His tale reminds us that reality is often stranger and more complex than fiction, that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones we never see coming, and that the greatest victories are sometimes achieved by those who never appear to be fighting at all. The streets of Chicago are quieter now than they were in Tony's best days, but their stories live on in whispers passed down through generations of criminals, cops, and ordinary citizens who understand that the line between the legal and illegal worlds has always been thinner than we like to believe. In hotel rooms and restaurant booths, in courthouse hallways and suburban kitchens, people still tell stories about the man who proved that in America, anyone can achieve greatness, even if the path they choose leads through the shadows. Tony Accardo's story is finally a uniquely American tale, one that could have happened nowhere else and at no other time. It is a story about reinvention and aspiration, about the power of intelligence and patience, about the complex relationship between image and reality in a society built on dreams and ambitions. It is a story that reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are not always the ones we fear most, but sometimes the ones we never fear at all. Until the next story brings us together in these quiet hours when the past seems closer than the present. Remember that every city has its secrets, every street has its stories, and every life, even the most carefully hidden, eventually becomes part of the larger story of human ambition and result. Tony Accardo understood this truth better than most, and in the end, he became exactly what he had always sought to be, a legend whispered in shadows, a ghost that haunts the meeting point of dreams and nightmares in the American experience. Sweet dreams. The streets of Chicago are quiet now, but their stories live on in whispers, and the legend of Big Tuna, the man who ruled an empire without raising his voice, continues to echo through the halls of power and the alleys of memory, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who never look dangerous at all.